Welcome to Rights and Wrongs, a new weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Anthony Gale. Today we're talking about Vietnam, a country seeing its global influence grow as governments wrestle for power in the region. At the same time, the Communist Party of Vietnam is ramping up its surveillance, harassment and prosecutions of anybody they deem critical. Today, even a social media post can land you in jail. As governments rush to build political bridges with Vietnam, is there a risk that human rights concerns could be swept downstream? I'm joined today by Phil Robertson, Deputy Director for Asia at Human Rights Watch, and we'll be discussing Vietnam's abysmal human rights record and whether closer ties with the country could be making a bad situation worse. Phil, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Firstly, Phil, can you briefly explain why Vietnam's influence appears to be growing?
Well, Vietnam is on one hand the beneficiary of what we're calling a new Cold War between the U.S. and China out in the Southeast Asia region. It is seen as being an opponent of China. It is seen as a country that is ultimately could be brought in as an ally to a wider alliance. And that's one of the reasons that there's been invited, for instance, to the G7 meeting that just took place in Hiroshima. That's why we see prime ministers from Australia going and making big pledges. That's why we see, high-level meetings in France and other parts of Europe for senior leaders of the government and the Vietnamese Communist Party. It's seen as a country that is a mid-level country, mid-level economically, large in terms of population, and also a place where, as companies move supply chains out of China, they can relocate to Vietnam.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned China because China's well known as a human rights abuser. But if you look at the international rankings, Vietnam ranks incredibly close in almost every single indices, basically very close to the bottom. Press freedom is non-existent and critics are routinely harassed and imprisoned. And yet when people think of Vietnam, a lot of people think of holidays. They won't necessarily think of human rights abuses. So what is it about Vietnam that allows these human rights abuses to seem to effectively fly under the radar?
Well, it's a very good question. People forget that Vietnam is one of the several remaining communist countries in the world. This is a single-party dictatorship where the party controls everything, and civil and political rights are simply non-existent in many cases. Why do people associate Vietnam as being somehow kinder and gentler than China or North Korea? Well, there's a bunch of issues. Part of it's historical, the long anti-colonial struggle against, first the French and then later the Americans or in the Vietnam War. Vietnam is seen as a growing country, a country that is exporting and is doing well economically. So it's a country where people want to emulate that. There's a number of reasons, but I think ultimately people are sort of glossing over Vietnam's very bad human rights record and seeing what they want to see, which is a country on the move that is moving upwards in the global community.
You've mentioned that media is effectively all state controlled. How difficult is it for an organisation like Human Rights Watch to report about abuses in Vietnam? Because I know from your own experience, when I believe you were kicked out or your visa was revoked in 2014. How does Human Rights Watch expose abuses in Vietnam?
We're increasingly seeing a crackdown on the environmental NGO movement. 5 of the top climate change activists have faced bogus tax evasion charges. 4 of them are behind bars right now. There's an ongoing expanding crackdown against foreign NGOs operating in the country. So quite clearly, any sort of activity that is seen by the government as supporting independent civil society, supporting independent opinions, is something that the party is immediately suspicious of and will move against if it continues.
So what are the risks for people undertaking research for Human Rights Watch in Vietnam?
Well, if they're uncovered, they would certainly be arrested. And Vietnam has really no hesitation in detaining foreign nationals. For instance, we have the case of Chow Van Cam, This gentleman, he's over 60 years old. He's an Australian national. He's also a Vietnamese national. And he was arrested. They claim that he was involved with an opposition political party. And he has been in prison for almost half a dozen years. No matter how hard the Australian government appeals for his release and restoration, return to Australia where his family is, Vietnam is just not budging.
So you've mentioned the crackdown on activists, particularly environmentalists, but in the same breath, very recently, I believe it was December, the UK, EU, and US pledged, I believe, 15 billion in funding for climate change projects. How does this square? Do you think when we can see environmentalists being arrested, that global governments are doing enough as they forge these closer ties with Vietnam?
Well, it's a very big concern. This is the Just Energy Transition Program. And what we're talking about here is support for Vietnam to change from a future where their primary source of energy is from coal and other fossil fuels to a movement towards renewable energy. And most people support that. I mean, that is, I think, the way it's going in terms of trying to combat climate change. But part of the problem is that if you arrest the key people who have been leading the movement for action on climate change, you deny any sort of popular participation in the kind of policies that are required for that kind of transition to take place. Vietnam doesn't understand. They think that, okay, we can just get the money and we can lock up the critics and no one will care. And what has happened is the international community has done very little to dissuade them of that attitude. Vietnam believes right now that it's in the driver's seat, that it is, since it's anti-China, since it's an ally with the U.S. and others. We just had the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, over there saying nice things about the government. There's a rumor of the Vietnamese Communist Party General Secretary going to the White House very soon. All these things lead the Vietnam government to believe that they can get away with rights abuses. And that's why it's so critical, I think, for governments, particularly the UK and the European Union and its member states, who are supposedly going to lead on this just energy transition program for Vietnam, to start putting conditions on it that, if you want that money, you need to release all these environmental activists to start with.
Just to sort of highlight the extent of the abuses, because obviously environmentalists are being locked up, activists, political opponents. But I think what's quite striking about Vietnam is it goes much deeper than that. And I think a case that really highlights that is Bui Ton Lam, so-called Green Onion Bay. And for people that aren't familiar with this example or this case, effectively what happened was the very famous celebrity chef, Salt Bay, the guy that does the salt on the steak, he was filmed feeding a $2,000 steak to a government minister. A few days later, a local noodle shop owner did a parody. He effectively replaced the steak covered in gold with noodles, green onions, and I believe it was pork. Just by doing that parody video, which went viral, it made him a sensation, but it also put him in the crosshairs of the Vietnamese government. Ultimately, a couple of weeks ago, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, I believe 4 years probation. I think that really highlights the extent and the control of the Vietnamese government. This is something you're very familiar with. Can you just outline the journey from obviously doing this parody to ending up behind bars? What did Bui Ton Lam face in response or in retaliation from the government?
Well, Bui Ton Lam made fun of the minister for public security, To Lam, not a relation, and he is someone who obviously doesn't have a sense of humor. Interesting, he was going there. He's eating the steak, $2,000 golden crusted steak at Salt Bay's restaurant. The reason he was in London, because he was leading the government delegation to COP26 to talk about climate change. So, he's there, eating expensive steak, probably the least climate change friendly food that you could imagine, on somebody's dime, $2,000 is more than he makes in a month in terms of his salary. So, obviously there's some corruption element here. So Bui Tam Lam, made fun of him, and the government certainly went after him. They went after him very, very quickly. They tried to shut down his noodle stand. They called him in for interrogation, and they put him under surveillance. He faced, really a gamut of harassment and abuse until they finally decided to arrest him. But what they did was they had to wait long enough for the sort of laughter to die down from the parody video, because what was happening was people were coming to his noodle stand in Da Nang, to say, I support you. They were taking their photos at his stand. The Vietnamese people are very, very courageous in general, and they know that their government is full of these dictatorial actors who are corrupt, and they are always concerned and trying to find a way to get their views across. So the parody video resonated because it was funny, but it was also because it was right on target. What happened then, of course, after Bui Tan Lam got arrested finally, about 6 months after he'd produced the video, they said it wasn't about the video, but they said it was about other Facebook posts that he had put out there. But really, it was about the video. His family was not allowed to see him. His lawyer was not allowed to see him. The authorities at one point claimed that, hey, he doesn't want a defense lawyer. And when his wife protested that and filed a petition at the police station, they relented. He had like 20-minute meeting with his lawyer, with the police basically staring over their shoulder. But then they retaliated against his wife, preventing her from attending the actual trial that took place in Da Nang. She was subsequently roughed up by the police. They dragged her when they were yelling, free Bui Tan Lam. They dragged her across the road. They tore her pants. They bruised her legs. They threw her into a police car. They beat up Bui Tan Lam's two brothers, who were also on the picket line, and then interrogated her for several hours before finally releasing her well after the trial was over. And now they've threatened her again, saying, if you don't keep quiet, something might happen to you.
I mean, what I'm trying to wrap my head around is, how has Vietnam arrived at a place where posting something on social media could land you in jail? I mean, is there certain laws? I mean, how did they get there?
Well, there's a whole set of what they call national security laws, which say that you can't have propaganda against the state. You can't do anything to what they call disrupt the unity policy. There's even a law that says that you cannot use democratic rights, and they set them out, freedom of expression, freedom of association, to infringe on the interests of the state. They set out that, those interests include what's good for the Communist Party, what's good for the leadership, what's good for the history of the party. I mean, they basically have extremely expansive rights abusing statutes, as part of their penal code that allow the authorities to do anything they want. They can charge, using democratic freedoms to infringe the interests of the state. What does that mean? It means anything that the authorities want. And all these various different so-called national security laws also contain provisions that say that they don't have to provide access to a lawyer for the defendant until after the police interrogation is done. Often the police interrogation goes for 6 months, 9 months of pretrial detention. That's invariably where we have found people who are in detention are tortured. So this is a fundamental problem. And this is when we talk about the 150 plus persons who are behind bars as political prisoners. Most of them are there under one or many of these so-called national security crimes.
You're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Anthony Gale, and I'm talking with Human Rights Watch Asia Deputy Director Phil Robertson about Vietnam's crackdowns on free speech. Okay, Phil, with TV, radio, print media all controlled by the government, and people relying so heavily on social media for unfiltered information, surely social media should be doing more in this space. I mean, I was reading a report recently that shows um, Facebook, 90% of government requests to take down content on Facebook were granted. YouTube removed almost 3,000 videos. I mean, what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is are social media giants or tech companies doing enough to support human rights in Vietnam?
They're certainly not doing enough to support human rights in Vietnam. And in fact, while I would argue that Facebook resisted for a while, they have basically capitulated by now. YouTube and Google were hopeless from the very beginning. Now the government is starting to go after TikTok, and we're seeing also pressure coming on Twitter and others. There is a law that has been set out that requires social media that is operating in Vietnam to have presence in Vietnam. That is, of course, anathema for these international tech companies. They don't want to have that. And only TikTok does have that. They're saying, well, if you don't comply with our government requests, we may enforce that requirement that you have to be here. And the reality is, Facebook and YouTube are making a lot of money from advertisements in Vietnam. Social media is very, very popular. There's a massive number of users, and it's critical in terms of the information that people get. But it's also an area that is increasingly contested. I think if Vietnam had its way, the government could snap its fingers. They would love to impose the kind of controls that China has on the internet. But the reality is that they didn't close the wall. You have Facebook in there, you have Google in there, all those various different internet companies that are not allowed into China are in fact in Vietnam. And so instead, the government is trying to claw back control, going after dissidents. We have information about a Task Force 47, which is a group of cyber trolls that are working for the government. Now we're talking about there's a new cybercrime law that's talking about coming forward. It's constant pressure on freedom in the internet. And if we look at what the actual people are doing, the dissidents, they put their information out on the internet. This is important for Vietnam because Vietnam has a very strong literary tradition. People write things, people communicate in writing. So, the idea of doing long Facebook posts, providing information on Facebook or other various different social media platforms is something that is very appealing, and people do get a lot of information that way, and the government realized that, and that's why they're trying to shut it down.
Do you think tech companies should have an ethical duty to resist? Because I was reading, and I don't know whether it was the law that you mentioned, but Vietnam, there are rumours they're going to try and bring in a 24-hour law, which would force social media companies to take down content within 24 hours. I mean, should tech companies be pushing back on that? Can they do more in that space? Or is it, as you say, all about the money?
Well, I think they should do a lot more. But I think they have convinced themselves. I know that Facebook has convinced themselves, and others have convinced themselves that if, in fact, they push back too hard, that Vietnam will kick them out. I have argued with Facebook and others. I said, look, if the government of Vietnam really wanted to be truly unpopular, it would try to kick you out of the country. And the resistance and the anger of the Vietnam people would force them to do a U-turn within 24 hours. But these social media companies, they exist to make money. And they are convinced that they will face a serious threat to their model if they in turn really stand up to refuse the takedown demands from the Vietnam government. And the Vietnam government is not bashful at all in terms of not only going after the content, but also harassing local staff of these social media companies. So there has been pressure, for instance, on Facebook staff. There has been pressure on Google staff who are in the country who are, dealing with the government. This is a government that really sort of has a no holds barred attitude when it wants something done.
I mean, the picture you're painting is quite a bleak one. it feels as though you've got social media that's putting profits ahead of people, and you've got politicians that are thinking perhaps more about the geopolitics. I know that the EU officials will be in Hanoi this week for, I think it's annual human rights dialogues with the government. I mean, do you hold much hope for those discussions, or is it effectively a PR exercise to paper over wider
Well, I think
investments?
unfortunately that the government of Vietnam is not listening to the kind of entreaties that they will hear from the EU officials. I mean, I do believe the EU officials are trying to deliver human rights messages, but the message itself, the spoken word, an occasional statement, is simply not enough to turn the head of the Vietnam government and get them to think about doing something else. That is the fundamental problem. And what we don't see is from, for instance, the European Union, we don't see a commitment to step up the game. When the EU in 2020 signed an agreement with Vietnam, they signed a comprehensive free trade agreement. The argument was made that this was going to make human rights better in Vietnam. This was going to lead to improvements. In fact, the situation has gotten worse. And that agreement contains within it conditionality that Vietnam must comply with the number of the major international human rights treaties, as well as a number of the core conventions of the International Labor Organization. And Vietnam is simply not doing it, and they're not being called for it. That's the fundamental problem. I mean, what we need to see is a willingness from the European Union to say, look, we signed a trade agreement. There were certain conditions there. You're not meeting the conditions. So there's penalties for that. Certain things are going to get taken away, or you're not going to get a visit to France. You're not going to get a visit to this place or that place. You're not going to get the kind of reception that you think you deserve as an up and coming nation from the global South because of your human rights record. That's the sort of political commitment that needs to be made. The Vietnamese government is highly transactional. When it thought it was going to get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the U.S. was pushing very hard on human rights back in 2014 and 2015, we also saw a lot of improvements in the human rights record in Vietnam because they thought if they gave way on some human rights issues, they would get the kind of trade deal that they wanted. Now they've realized that they don't have to give anything because no one is pressing them in the way that is needed to make serious concessions on human rights if they want to be a respected member of the international community.
So, I mean, beyond, because obviously a critical role in lobbying for human rights improvements in the country does come through politics and through institutions. I mean, for people listening, is there anything we can do, or journalists? I mean, how can we support people in Vietnam to raise awareness or improve the situation there? Is there anything, ordinary people sitting at home can do to put this issue on the agenda?
Well, I think people who are, for instance, in North America, Australia, New Zealand, various different parts of Europe, who are concerned about human rights in Vietnam, need to raise these issues with their parliamentarians. They need to raise these issues with their government. They have to, talk about human rights issues. Why is Vietnam getting a free ride when other countries are getting a lot of criticism? There's a bit of a double standard here. Is a rights abuse in Vietnam less severe than a rights abuse in, say, Cambodia or Thailand, just because it happens in Vietnam? How is that fair? So, I think that we're not seeing the kind of priority placed on these human rights issues in Vietnam because, companies want to do business with Vietnam. Governments think this is the new great ally against the Chinese. There's discussions about how do we, have a just energy transition in Vietnam. So many other people are investing certain hopes in Vietnam that may not be necessarily justified by what is going on the ground. I think it's people to wake up and see the real Vietnam, the real government there, and not imagine the sort of thing that they think should be there. Because that's the problem. The government is taking advantage of that gap. They're taking advantage of the ability to get things for free because they hold out the potential of some progress in some other area.
And finally, I mean, is there any final thought you would like to raise on this issue or share with the audience?
Well, I think ultimately the international community is failing the people of Vietnam. The international community needs to stand up for human rights. They need to be speaking up. It's quite clear in a repressive system like Vietnam that there's limitations to what people can do there, but the actual activists and dissidents in Vietnam are incredibly courageous. I mean, if I look around various parts of Southeast Asia where I work, I can't think of any group of activists that are, so willing to basically just stand up to power, and even by themselves, do the kind of things they know will get them arrested, because they feel that this is the right thing to do. The world needs to see it, and even if it's only on my Facebook page, I know I'm doing the right thing, and my government is violating my rights, and somebody needs to come help. And the fact that we are in touch with the families of many of these activists, that they see us speaking for them, and putting out press releases and demanding their release, and demanding action by governments, I think gives some heart to those local people, that they're not alone, that somebody is standing by them, and somebody will continue to have their back.
Well, thank you so much, Phil, for joining me. It's been a fascinating conversation, and hopefully, we've started a few more conversations about the situation in Vietnam, which, as you say, isn't getting the coverage it deserves. You've been listening to Rights and Wrongs, a new podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers are Christine Varganova and Blair Palmer. Our engineer is Kosi Ogbuli. I'm, as ever, Anthony Gale. Join us next week for another edition of Rights and Wrongs, stories from the human rights frontline. Until next week.